Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Patricia Mota, and I am currently serving as President and CEO for the Hispanic Alliance for Career Enhancement. I am happy to join BDPA today, and thank you for the kind invitation to Terry Morris and all of the leadership team and volunteers for welcoming me and for the invitation to join you today. Today's topic is the theme that I get to carry out at ASE, the Hispanic Alliance for Career Enhancement, as President and CEO this year, which is we lead at the intersection of identity, equity, and unity. And so throughout today's presentation, as I go through these slides and share some components of my story, I encourage you to reflect on what this means to you, what resonates, but most importantly, what key actions will be taken as a result. Good morning to everyone and welcome. I am excited about this year's theme as well. It aligns perfectly with leading together and ensuring that we are making the impact across the country. So we lead at the intersection of identity, equity, and unity. As President and CEO, I've been with the organization since 2010, but my career trajectory spans from co-founding a nonprofit organization as an undergrad, specifically focused on helping underserved communities, to government affairs and higher education, to then working for a corporate utilities company and circling back to nonprofit in my role as a programs director in 2010. Then fast forward, leading partnerships and fundraising for the organization, and as president and CEO for the last 6 years. My journey has been led in so many ways, but I also share my background as serving as a Latina, as a daughter to immigrants, as Mexican American, but also as first generation in my family, obtaining a college degree and pursuing a higher education. And today's theme, we lead at the intersection of identity, equity, and unity, is something that we've carried out this past year. Identity, encouraging individuals to reflect on the multiple components that we each have, whether it be our race, gender, sexual orientation, hobbies, how we identify in terms of the roles that we play in our family as mother, daughter, grandmother. The roles that we play in our everyday are critical to really help us understand our purpose, our why, and really build a strong foundation as we lead through today's challenges and, most importantly, fast-paced environment. Equity, ensuring that not only we as individuals are advocating for ourselves, our worth in the workplace, in the communities that we represent, as workplaces, ensuring that we are building equitable structures, whether it's through our hiring processes, our advancement procedures within the workplaces. And unity is ensuring that across all community groups, we are working together to ensure that we are being effective allies and helping move the needle towards a more inclusive, equitable workplaces and overall society. And so the goal for today is for you to take what resonates with you as we go through these components and think about how is it that you're going to take it into action. The first one being leading with identity. And so here are some key folks you may or may not have heard of. But here's what 2 leaders have expressed: the importance of leading with identity, your why, your personal authentic self. We have leading with identity is greater importance more than ever. Leaders and organizations that lead with this lens build trust among their other colleagues, among the organizations, enhance retention and engagement, and thus productivity and overall the bottom line. Your personal identity should inform you as a leader, not the other way around. A leader's core values should be at the basis of your actions, and those who allow themselves to be defined by their roles are less effective by leadership. It must be through your identity, your why. This is the continuous practice of self-awareness that gives leaders the edge they require to define themselves authentically, which contributes to being a more effective leader overall. And so here are 2 specific leaders I mentioned. The first one on the top being Stedman Graham. And one thing that he's mentioned in one of his books called Identity Leadership is that My life has dramatically changed for the better when I began centering all that I do with my talents, strengths, and passions. As I came to understand my identity and my purpose in life, that enabled me to realize the value of education, information, and knowledge, began to make information relevant to my personal and professional development, and that allowed me to define my existence and take control of my life. Without a strong identity, we are more likely to be carried by the influence of our environment into a future requiring very little reflection or development. And we have Brene Brown. If she has a famous YouTube video, a couple, but her first one speaks to vulnerability and the importance of courage. And one quote is, she says here, let go of who you think you're supposed to be and embrace who you are. You either walk inside your story and own it, or stand outside of your story and hustle for your worthiness. Again, how is it that we are aligning with our identity, our mission, our purpose, with our competencies help us become most effective leaders? It's the continuous practice of self-awareness, and the more aware you are with your strengths, your capabilities, your why, it builds resiliency. Greater self-awareness leads to greater self-understanding of others, being able to adapt and flex when connecting with others, building trust. Reflect on your both good and bad personal experiences as they have shaped you. The more you are aware, the more you are able to adapt as a leader. As places of work, as leaders, as employers, we must embrace the intersectional identities that our employees bring to the workplace. We must encourage to have courageous conversations, listening towards. And as executives, as leaders, we must lead by example. And by unpacking purpose in today's world, the more business talk about purpose, the more it runs risk about just being another corporate buzzword. And in the trust firm form, purpose is different from the rest. Purpose answers an all-important question as to, for example, why a company exists. So there are some various research out there, and one of them being by Deloitte, that revealed that many consumers today make decisions based on how brands treat their people, how they treat the environment. And so similarly, as I'm sharing stories as individuals, how our identity, our purpose influences our leadership style, so similarly, it does so as corporate leaders and organizations. And so I'll share you with a couple examples in terms of my identity. One is, I identify as being an advocate for access and equity. Here you see on the screen in terms of a couple examples as why. As a daughter of immigrants, I do all that I can to try to justify the sacrifices that my parents made for my siblings and I to have a better life, a better education. And so as I pursued higher education, I had the opportunity to, through an AmeriCorps grant as an undergrad, it was a collaborative with the city of Bloomington, Indiana. I went to Indiana University. And also, through this grant, helped me co-found a nonprofit. The nonprofit is El Centro Comunal Latino. And the initiative was, there was an increase of Latino community coming outside into the community that needed information, needed referral services. And given the experience that I had with my parents and the challenges that they've experienced, it enabled me to help start this nonprofit. It enabled me through this grant to be able to ensure that I was working with the local business community, my peers at the university that were in the Spanish language department to come volunteer hours, the business community to help provide workshops, whether it was on immigration, on understanding your banking and finance, personal finance, on issues around predatory lending. So it's creating awareness. That nonprofit still exists, but for me, it became part of my own mission to ensure that I'm providing resources to the community because of my personal experience, but my identity as a daughter of immigrants as well. As a Mexican American, I'm also a godmother and aunt to 8 nieces and nephews. And I also had the experience where I tell people that I experienced the education gap that currently exists in our country. As a junior going from a sophomore to a junior in high school, I grew up in a predominantly low income Black and Mexican neighborhood, and had the opportunity to go to another high school my junior year. This high school was in a more affluent community. Both were public high schools, yet my first experience was a culture shock, going from predominantly Black and Mexican to predominantly white, but also a more affluent community. And that wasn't necessarily the eye-opening experience. I think as kids, we're resilient. We learn to connect and make friends. But some of the key things that were most eye-opening was my original high school. I was meeting with the guidance counselor maybe once or twice a year, versus my new high school. I was meeting with the guidance counselor on a weekly basis to prepare for my college plan, to prepare for that next step, what classes I was taking. My original high school, I was doing really well in terms of my academics, and the academic rigor in my new high school was completely different. I was placed into AP classes, physics, calc, and while they were a challenge, I was fortunate to be able to have great tutors to support me and get me through that. My original high school had recruiters, with all due respect to the military, but we only had recruiters from the military at our high school visiting us during lunch hours, talking to my peers and I, versus my new high school, we had college recruiters from universities all over. For me, that was an eye-opening experience in understanding that in our country, in the United States of America, depending on what social economic status you were, depending on what neighborhood you were growing up, meant what resources, what access information that was provided to you. And that is part of my identity that helped me then become an advocate for access and equity since then, where some of my eye-opening experiences enabled me to understand the disparities that exist in our underserved, underrepresented communities. And so fast forward, going into the workplace, there's been other challenges that existed, whether it be not getting the promotion, not being told that I wasn't ready enough or assertive enough, and kind of starting to understand some of the key challenges, whether it's microaggressions that a lot of our communities face in the workplace. And also understanding what were some of the privileges that myself and others had in the workplace as well. So think about, what are some of the key identities that you have that help you in your mission, in your passions, in your why, and connecting that to your competencies and what you bring to the workplace. As a woman growing up in a traditional Mexican-American strict household, I understood that gender norms in my community were not necessarily helpful for me once I got into the workplace. As a Latina in a traditional strict Mexican household, and many other cultures can relate, we were told calladita más bonita, which is the quieter you are, the more beautiful you are, encouraging women not to speak up, encouraging us to be more timid and humble. And so it wasn't until I got into the workplaces understanding that that was part of my identity, but then also helping other women understand what are some of the key challenges, that gender norms that perhaps you grew up with that are challenging in the workplace, and how to close that gap when it comes in the workplace. All of these lead to my purpose in closing gaps. And as individuals, we must reflect on what are our personal stories, both good and bad, that have created you to become the leader that you are today. I am a role model, a DEI practitioner, and leadership coach. My identity as a godmother to a biracial, soon-to-be 3-year-old girl, Andrina, an aunt to 8 nieces and nephews, as a first-generation college student to my extended family and others that I represent for this organization across the country, it is imperative that I serve as a role model, that I empower others to achieve their highest potential. These part of my identities have enabled me, have empowered me, motivate me to serve in these roles every single day. When things get challenging, to understand and to be able to reflect on these components of your identity help you really make that connection and build that strong foundation when things get challenging. And so I ask you to take action in terms of who are you? Some key things that I recommend is to journal and to self-reflect. Pre COVID, at least once a year, and some of us are able to do this and others not. But think about how you can, whether it's on a weekly basis or whether it's a weekend. On an annual basis, I would take a trip, a solo trip, uh, for a week and just journal, take books that I've been wanting to read, and self-reflect in terms of where am I in terms of my goals, but most importantly, how are these goals aligning with my purpose, my why, the identities that I represent on an annual basis to check in. Match your competencies with your passions. What are the key things that you're good at? Whether it's you've learned through self-assessments, whether it's others that have continuously told you, hey, you're really great at these three things. You're really great at building a community. You're really great at a specific role in your industry. Ensure that you're able to match that with your why, your stories. We are more than numbers and data. It's about making that connection to numbers and data, to the why, to the person in you. And I think more than ever, we see that as a country, we are desiring that to really get to know and connect on a more human way. And at the end of the day, we are all human. And ask questions. Ask if you're not sure, whether it's your family members, those that know you best, empower yourself to ask them, what would they identify as your key passions, as your key identities? And see if there's some alignment, if there's some common theme that you see to help you really strengthen who you are, and most importantly, to lead authentically with the identities that you represent, your why. And so I'll move over to the second of our three areas, which is leading with equity. And so many of us, especially the past year, have seen the increase of conversations around equity, equity being promoting justice impartially and fairness within procedures, processes, and distribution of resources or institutions and systems. So these some things to consider for today's conversations is, for you as an individual, are you doing all you can to build equity for yourself in the workplaces and the spaces that you represent? For us as organizations, employers, are we reflecting on the employee life cycle, the systems, the processes, the policies that are in place that are inequitable? And so I ask you to think about those two lenses as we go through this conversation. And this image helps us better define and talk about the differences between equity and equality, right? We hear that equality is being able to provide fairness, give the same to everyone. When in really the need is equity, is ensuring that we are meeting individuals where they are. Meeting individuals where they are, meeting communities where they are, in this case, helping provide the ladder that they need to be able to reach that apple on the tree, right? Not a one size fits all approach. And I think that as we increasingly become intersectional as a community, as we continuously become looking to build this within our workplaces, it's imperative that we look at everything from this lens and from this perspective. Leading with equity, I mean, we have been here this past year. We're starting to see a lot more in terms of what organizations are doing, the statements, and a lot with what's happening in society with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the Asian community, with many communities that have for way too long been underrepresented, undervalued in workplaces when it comes to leadership opportunities, when it comes to being inclusive of these groups across the board. And so it has been imperative, and particularly within the past year, a new era of corporate responsibility has emerged. Americans are increasingly demanding that businesses prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion, with 92% of Americans stating that it's important for companies to promote an economy that serves everyone. For the first time, we're seeing companies viewing equity as a business imperative to attract and retain top talent. Yet we are still seeing some articles within the past couple months one specifically by Business Insider that surveyed Black professionals that they're seeing that 78% mentioned that their senior leaders value DEI, but 40% say the support is more talk than action and think that their companies have not made any material changes specifically to policies or culture. Look at the pandemic, for example. Job loss and health disparities affected specifically Black and Brown communities, 9.2% and 8.6% compared to 5.7% for the Black and Latino community, for example, compared to the white community. So the murder of George Floyd, right? We talk about Adam Toledo. All of this has increased to increased DEI efforts, but the question still remains, are they intentional enough? Are they meaningful and effective enough? And I do believe that equity is a way of getting there. The increased focus on race identity has happened, where racism for the first time was used as a word in corporate America. The increased focus on racial equity, demands for accountability, transparency in the workplace. We've seen the hiring of chief diversity officers more than ever, and the talk about health inequity, specifically that impacts Black and Brown communities. The increased need for white allyship, for race unity in the workplaces, solving the issue for all communities is not an issue for one, but this is for all of us. This is something that we approach together, and we need to ensure that no one gets left behind. And where we are today is ensuring that we reflect on this so that we are, as we're making decisions when it comes to hiring, when it comes to processes or programs, we're reflecting on the last 18 months and what are some of the key issues. We see that organizations are focused increasingly, and so we've all seen these numbers in terms of the increase from 2020 to 2021 in terms of disparities, but you see when it comes to organizations valuing DEI compared to 2020, there's an increase saying that within the last year, at 2021, 6% of organizations say they are focusing on DEI versus in 2020, it was 25%. And so you see the increase and the need to ensure that we are moving organizations towards more equitable processes. And so something that our organization has done when it comes to leading equity is from the lens of programmatic lens. Equity is also ensuring, and especially being in such a fast-paced environment, and with upskilling specifically, ensuring that our employees have the right training and development to be successful in their careers is needed more than ever, and it's such a fast pace. So that's one example that we encourage our employer partners to ensure that they're building equity in the workplace. The other one within this last year that we saw as an example, especially those in my workplace, but also for our corporate partners that we work with across the country, was with technology, right? How are we ensuring that those that were not as comfortable with technology, with Zoom, with Microsoft Teams, for example, was ensuring that we were bringing them up to speed so that they did not feel left behind. And that was a key area of need, especially this past year. And the other not eye-opening, but I think that was brought to light in in a big way, was the digital inequities that are taking place in our Black and Brown communities. You all have heard the story where we had a family, a mother and her two children, that were participating in virtual classes right outside of I believe it was a library or some public place where they can get Wi-Fi because they didn't have Wi-Fi at home. And so I think, this past 18 months, this past year has exposed, 2020 has exposed a lot of the disparities that exist, but I am happy to see the progress that's happening as a result as well. And so for our organization, one way that we lead with equity, specifically for women, has been with a women's leadership program. Many of our companies either have them internally, many of our company employers have been supporting women to training programs externally. And this is one that we've done, because one of the key ways that we can build equitable workplaces is by ensuring that you are providing culturally relevant programming, culturally relevant training, meeting individuals, meeting communities where they are. In this instance with Mujeres de ACE, which is focused on women's leadership program, predominantly Latina. As a Latino serving organization, I always say we are Latino serving, not Latino exclusive. We've had non-Latinas also participate and benefit from this program. But one of the key things to keep in mind is that many of us, especially as first generation, whether it's in corporate America, may not see ourselves represented in leadership roles. And we still see the numbers. There's been progress for sure this past year. But it's not, if we don't see ourselves represented, and we all have heard this saying, you don't see it, you don't believe it. But it's so critical that during training programs like this, we leverage our network across the country to be able to bring in women executives, Latina executives from across different corporate sectors, to be able to come in as subject matter experts, as trainers, as guest speakers. And that is empowering. I think sometimes we lose sight on how critical that is, not only for the students that we've worked with throughout the year. We know that we love speaking to high school students, college students, but for professionals as well. I still get motivated and excited when I'm able to identify whether it's a speaker, or trainer, or leader that can resonate and has a similar shared experiences. We should never lose count of that. Not only are we providing folks that empowerment through bringing in these key subject matter experts and leaders, but also through the content. How is it through the content that we're ensuring that we're talking about where individuals are at? In this case, for Mujeres de ACE, we're talking about, as a Latina, what are some of the traditional cultural values or norms that we grew up with, whether it's the humility piece, whether it's the modesty piece, and understanding where you are. When I first went through this program and other similar programs, it was eye-opening for me. I was initially quiet in meetings and thought, I was going to take notes and not speak up unless, I was asked to. Because that's how I grew up. I didn't know that it was expected in the workplace to be able to speak up, to contribute to meetings, but I wasn't comfortable. But it wasn't comfortable, and I wasn't aware that I wasn't comfortable, because until I reflected on my upbringing, on my culture, then I was able to get into those meetings and say, okay, right now is the time I need to speak up. So I was able to adapt. And it's not about changing who you are, because I would always embrace who I am. But it's creating that awareness with our leaders, with our employees, with ourselves, to say, this is what I'm comfortable with, but this is the instance that I need to speak up and to advocate. And programs like this, whether it be a women's leadership program, whether it be a specific catered training that's catered, let's say, to a specific age population, whether it's in the LGBTQ community, it's critical that we are looking for these types of resources for ourselves, but as employers, bring them to our employees, ensure that they have access to resources that resonate with them, that meet them where they are. And so how do we continue to build equity? Is do our research, ensure that we are becoming more aware in terms of the different groups, whether it's in our respective teams, whether it's for ourselves. Having courageous conversations, and I know especially the past 18 months, we've done a lot of that, right? We've talked about have really tough conversations, but also being willing to share for yourself, what are some of your key challenges as the community that you represent, and for others, if they're not willing to speak up, being able to be there for them. And asking questions, ensuring that if you're not sure for that employee or that colleague, that what could help them out in terms of meeting them where they are, at the end of the day, ask them, how do you think we can help you get to that next level? How do you think we can get you whether promoted or that next visibility project, that next speaking opportunity? So it's about having those conversations and ensuring you're asking. And I'll move on, and I know we want to get to questions and engagement, so feel free. I'll pause here to ensure that if you want to comment in the chat, you have any questions or have anything to contribute, right? I think one of the great things about conferences is we get to connect and learn from one another as well. And the third and the final piece, which aligns perfectly with the theme that BDPA is hosting during this conference, is on leading with unity. And with the theme, we lead at the intersection of identity, equity, and unity. Unity for us is in many ways also allyship and building allyship across communities. It's about understanding some of the key issues. And I will say that no one, whether myself as a DEI practitioner, whether it's the communities that you represent, nobody has this 100% right. The DEI, no one has it 100% right. We each come in with our own perceptions, our own biases, and our own lens to things. And so it's critical that in the spaces that we're in, we're understanding, asking questions, and that we're building empathy. We'll be creating awareness and understanding what are some of the key challenges, the key concepts of self and others, that we're being active, but most importantly, that we're taking action. And I think the action piece is more critical than ever, ensuring that we are advocating and that we're speaking up. And some of the ways that we can lead better with unity, I'll share with you is by first and foremost is understanding intersectionality. And intersectionality was something that we as an organization started talking more about 3 years ago, I should say, where it was specific to the Latino community. In this case, and helping create awareness that Latinos, for example, we represent 27 countries of origin. And here as a US Hispanic Latinx cohort, some of us are first generation in this country, second, third, fourth, and depending on where we are, whether it be Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, fifth, sixth generation of Latinos here in this country. And the 27 countries of origin, that means we also identify differently, whether it's as New Rican, I have Puerto Rican roots and I grew up in the Bronx in New York, whether it's Quisqueyano, El Salvadoreño, and really understanding that, within the Latino community, not only is that a part of the intersectional identities that we represent, but also some of us are part of the LGBTQ community. 25% of Latinos represent as Afro-Latinos. And some of us also have other identities, right? And so it's really understanding that not a one box approach, that for Latinos, we're gonna do this one thing and we're gonna cover it all, right? For Latinos, it's just one issue and we're gonna cover it all. No, intersectionality, and this was a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the 1990s when she specifically addressed the identity of Black women, saying not only as a woman, but as a Black African-American woman, there are additional oppressors or challenges or discrimination that's happening as a result of not only being a woman, but as a Black woman. And so it's also important to think of intersectional identities not only as the further oppression that it may create, but also the privilege, right? I could be considered as a, let's say, white presenting Latina. And because of that, that gives me additional privileges that white Caucasian communities may be offered, right, in certain spaces and communities. And so understanding intersectionality, what we see not only on the surface level, but underneath, and really taking time to reflect helps us address and be more effective at not only building equitable spaces, but being an effective ally. Being an avid learner, right? I think this past year, there was a lot more resources that became available, or at least that people became aware of, right? Additional books, the courses, one thing that I've set up in terms of Google alerts, and being that this year especially our theme as an organization is around identity, equity, and unity. I set up a Google alert to ensure I was receiving anything that had to do with new DEI leaders, with the theme around equity, so that I was always presenting the most relevant, up-to-date information as I'm talking. So what are some of the alerts that you can do in terms of whether it's specific communities that we don't know so much about, whether it's specific efforts and things like that within your own organization, hiring processes, how are we becoming an avid learner? Podcast, books. And I love this statement that says, the conversation you've been avoiding to have is actually a leadership opportunity. How are we taking advantage of being a courageous leader in our workspaces, asking questions, advocating for others, and really taking action to be that effective ally in our organizations? And with that, it's also about being an advocate. What are some of the listening sessions, ensuring that we're providing, taking education, reporting back, and repeating. More than ever, we know not only the business imperative for diversity, but it's also ensuring that we are communicating and repeating and communicating why it's essential that we're including communities, specific communities, in hiring processes when it comes to advancement, when it comes to leadership roles in your respective organizations. And one way that we were able to really focus on unity in 2020 as an organization is being that we've been doing cohort trainings and leadership trainings since early 2000s. We were asked by two of our partners to be able to take our leadership training model and put a cohort together that was not just focused on Latinos, but other community groups as well. And so we were able to launch a cohort, a multicultural cohort. Two of our corporate partners specifically focused on three communities, and those communities being the AAPI, the Latino community, and also the Black community. Each of these two corporate partners selected same number of participants of each community to be in this cohort. And what we did as an organization in efforts of leading with unity was ensuring that we worked with other groups that worked, professional associations that served each of these communities to come in to lead some of the trainings, but to partner with them, right? So that it wasn't just us that were leading this program, but also we included intercultural assessments such as the Intercultural Development Inventory, had conversations around that. And one of the things that I was most proud of was during these training sessions to hear some of the shared pain, shared challenges, shared, but also the awareness that some things are very different for some groups than others, and why that was, and what were some of the traditional cultural norms or nuances that were presented in each of the groups. And most importantly, building a strong, unified support network across the communities where there's a WhatsApp group amongst this graduating cohort. So we started this cohort in September of 2020. They graduated in April 2021 of this year. And I still see conversations on the WhatsApp in terms of sharing resources, but most importantly, really putting into practice that leading with unity and being effective allies and support and advocates for one another. And so I encourage you to take to think and reflect in terms of what are some of the key things that you can do when it comes to leading with unity and being that effective ally for your community, for all communities. And so I encourage you to take the leap and lead together. We'll power it together. And here is me taking the jump from with our U.S. Army at the U.S. Army Bowl in 2016, so some years back. Many of us sometimes are fearful to take that jump to speak up. And I think now we know that, or at least a lot of us have been encouraged and empowered to do so. But whether it's, advocating for yourself for that promotional opportunity or advocating for others, take the leap and lead. And know that you have family and others, because we do this together. And if I may be of any support in any way through the work that we're doing, please feel free to connect. And I'm happy to provide any resources to you. I'll pause here and take any questions or comments. And I see a question on how can senior leaders take more action as opposed around equity. I hope through some of the things I mentioned, but I think first and foremost, it's about role modeling behavior. And, there were a lot of statements that were made, and whether it's press releases, statements from CEOs, and I think the ones that we're able to follow through with programming, with really evaluating hiring processes, ensuring that there's diverse representation on hiring committees, ensuring that the pool of candidates were not the same universities and colleges. So it's being able to look at processes and structures, but also ensuring that senior leaders are are leading by action and really pushing for those efforts.
Are there any other questions for Patricia? You can put it in the Q&A or the chat.
So I see, Martin, what is the general interest as far as industries with younger minorities? I don't want to assume the question. My perception of the question is, let's say, like the Gen Z population, the millennial population. One thing that I do say we work with over 150 corporate partners across the countries and organization, helping with their hiring, with leadership development, thought leadership. And one thing that I do say out loud to our corporate partners, some of them are further along than others, but I do not believe, as of what I see now, that corporate America is evolving fast enough to keep up with which will be the majority workforce, millennials and Gen Z. The expectation, as we've seen and research from either Deloitte, McKinsey, is that they're looking to be able to be in a workplace, and this is from our talent pool that we work with as well, is what is this employer doing to give back to the community that I represent? And most importantly, how can I be involved? I want meaningful work. We've seen, right, that we are facing the Great Resignation, meaning that, and the publications show that people are leaving their jobs at a much faster rate than we've seen in the past decade. And so with that, it's some of them, a good chunk of them are because they're looking for purpose and for meaning in their work. The other one, there's challenges around COVID and fear of returning to work depending on the industry. And so I think about purpose and the importance of that more than ever, and an employer being able to talk to that candidate, showcase to that candidate how they can live in their purpose and be in an environment, in a workplace that's doing that with their corporation.
Patricia, there's a question. What is one thing you would tell your younger self?
One thing, I think that's a great question, and you hear it all the time. To not be fearful. I think that's something that I've learned over time, is that fear is a feeling, and you jump in anyways. There are certain times where, again, I wouldn't speak up, and it's just I didn't have the awareness in terms of I was not comfortable speaking up because that's just how I grew up. It wasn't until I had that self-awareness of understanding my story, my identity, my culture, and how that trickled into the workplace, that then I was able to make the shift, right? And I think if our young people are like our high school curriculum, if we can embed that somehow, and I know some schools are starting to do that, that would just catapult our young people at much faster rate in terms of them understanding who they are, their strengths, their capabilities, and living in their true purpose. And I see a question in terms of, are there any stats you can share about D&I regarding the Black community from what you've seen? There's a lot of stats. I think one in particular that is quite, I saw it two weeks ago regarding corporate boards, and this is by Heidrick and Struggles, one of the executive search consulting firms. 2 weeks ago, it was just released, and they showcased that in 2020, Black serving on corporate boards went from 8% to 23%. So it's a significant increase of Blacks now, and that did showcase those particular companies that were able to bring Black leaders onto their corporate boards. We're able to showcase that, hey, the talent's out there, right? We can't make the excuse that we hear it in the Latino community, we hear it in the Black community, I just can't find them. There was a statement made, right, from the Wells Fargo executive or the CEO that said that they couldn't find it. That's not true, right? And there's organizations like BDPA, like the work that we're doing at Asset that says we have the talent pool. It's up to the employers to leverage these as resources by engaging in these types of conferences, and really making an effort and ensuring that they're leveraging these types of resources in organizations. But other stats, I mean, there's others out there. Well, that was one that I think was nice to see in terms of actually showcasing progress in terms of diverse representation in leadership roles, in this case being corporate boards. Carl, a question on, thank you, on how thoughts to help youth to identify their talents. So that's exactly what I just mentioned. I wish, one way that we've heard of assessments, right? And some of us, like myself, for the very first time, I wasn't aware, MBTI, StrengthsFinder, I utilize, I'm an Insights Global Discovery practitioner. We utilize these throughout our leadership training programs, but even with our high school and our college programs, we use a StrengthsFinder. I haven't seen anything as of yet specific for that age group, but StrengthsFinder seems to be pretty easy to understand and tangible for that age group. So that's something we use for our college student program, to help them start understanding their strengths and competencies. But others that I would suggest is just going through a self-awareness process. Is what are some of the key challenges, key experiences that you have with, for example, when we talked about identity at the very beginning, and helping youth understand how does that translate to what you can do in your career, right? And making that connection is easier said than done, but helping them walk through that, I think, should be something included in curriculum and programs.
Do we have any other questions? Patricia, do you have any closing thoughts you want to share?
No, I thank you to you, to BDPA, Terry Morris, his leadership, for the invitation to join you all today. Should I be of service with the work that I lead at Asset, or anything that I shared today, please feel free to reach out. It would be my pleasure to connect. If it's not me, I connect you with those that can support you. So thank you, and please remember that we lead at the intersection of identity, equity, and unity.